All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon and welcome to the Southern Legislative Conference webinar entitled In the Weeds, Exploring the Science Around Medical Marijuana and the Operation of a State Program. My name is Lauren Greer and I'm the Human Services and Public Safety Analyst with the Southern Legislative Conference, which is the Southern Office of the Council of State Governments. Thank you to everybody for taking the time to join us today. Before we begin, let me make a few housekeeping notes. You all are in listen-only mode, but if you would like to ask a question, please type it in the question box on the GoToWebinar toolbar. You may do so at any time during the webinar, and we will try to get to as many of your questions as possible before the end of the program. Also note that we will be recording this event, and it will be available online at the CSG Knowledge Center at www.knowledgecenter.csg.org or on the SLC website at www.slcatlanta.org. We're going to be talking about medical marijuana, as the title suggests, and medical marijuana is an issue that has been on the legislative agenda in many states for a number of years, but it wasn't until recently that the southern state legislatures began to grapple with the complexities of the issue. Currently, there are 21 states and the District of Columbia allow for the smoking of marijuana for medicinal purposes. In 1996, California became the first state to legalize medical marijuana, and since then, 10 states have followed by legalizing medical marijuana through public vote, and 10 others have legalized it through legislative action. This year, Minnesota and New York legalized medical marijuana, but they do not allow for smoking as a delivery method. In November of this year, residents in Florida will have the chance to vote on legalizing medical marijuana in their state. And if petitioners are successful in collecting the required number of signatures, Oklahoma could follow. Although Arkansas did not collect enough signatures to get the approved language on the ballot this year, medical marijuana is certainly an issue that will continue to persist. During the 2014 legislative session, states saw a surge of legislation seeking to legalize medical cannabis in some form. And although it was not a full-scale legalization of medical marijuana, several states, including 8 SLC states, passed legislation to allow for the limited use of a low-THC cannabis derivative commonly known as cannabidiol or CBD. Despite the growing trends of states legalizing medical marijuana, legislators continue to have more questions than answers, including, among others, the practical questions about research on the efficacy of medical marijuana and how to best regulate its use in their state. We're honored today to have 3 presenters that will attempt to answer some of those questions as we dig a little deeper into the research of medical marijuana and the operation of a state program. We're grateful to all of our presenters for their willingness to participate and share their perspective with us. Our first presenter will be Ms. Sue Rucci. She is the president and CEO of National Families in Action. Founded in 1977, National Families in Action has long sought to educate the public on the dangers associated with drug abuse and addiction, while also seeking to educate parents on how to protect children from these dangers. In addition to speaking around the world, Ms. Rucci has testified before congressional committees, appeared on national television, and written numerous syndicated articles. Our second presenter will be Mr. Ryan Hurley. Mr. Hurley is a partner at Rose Law Group in Scottsdale, Arizona, and the head of the firm's Medical Marijuana Practice Group. He has been involved with Arizona's medical marijuana law since before its ballot approval in 2010 and has worked closely with the Arizona Department of Human Services to develop the rules for Arizona's medical marijuana program. Our last presenter will be Dr. Suzanne Sisley. Dr. Sisley is an Arizona-based physician and is currently serving as an associate professor of internal medicine and psychiatry with the telemedicine program at the University of Arizona College of Medicine. Notably, Dr. Sisley is the principal investigator for the only FDA-approved randomized controlled trial that will look at the use of marijuana by combat veterans who have treatment-resistant post-traumatic stress disorder. Unfortunately, Ms. Rucci won't be able to join us for the entirety of our program, so she will present first, after which she will take a few minutes to answer questions. Following Ms. Rucci, there will be additional time for questions at the end of our program, following both Mr. Hurley and Dr. Sisley's presentations. With that, I will now turn it over to Ms. Rucci.
Thank you so much. It's lovely to be here, and I am pleased to be a part of this effort with the other panelists, and I say hello to you both, and I'm sorry that I won't be able to be here the whole time and hear your presentations, but I will certainly watch it on the computer later on the internet. So first, I want to begin by saying that the issue of medical marijuana is extremely complicated, which is why I think we have so many people on this webinar today trying to understand some of the issues. And second, I want to agree with what I know that the other panelists are going to say, and that is that we need quite a bit more research in all areas of this complicated topic. So if we could go to the first slide, please. Thank you. So there are some key elements that everyone, I think, needs to try to understand, which contribute to the confusion and the questions that a lot of folks have. The first thing is that those people who are selling marijuana medicines in the states where marijuana has been legalized for medical use, none of them has submitted their products to the Food and Drug Administration for approval to market them to the public. And this has some very significant implications for the public. One is that there's no guarantee that any of these medicines have met tests of purity and therefore are safe and pure, nor have they met safety tests in that they've not been tested in clinical trials or even in preclinical research, and they've not been tested to see if they're actually effective, which are all criteria that the Food and Drug Administration imposes upon medicine makers before they're allowed to market their products to the public. Marijuana is renowned for containing mold and mildew and pesticides and sometimes even pathogens such as E. coli. And people out there in the states where marijuana has been legalized for medical use have no guarantee that they're not being exposed to any of these contents. And in fact, here's an example. In Colorado, which legalized medical marijuana in 2000, the state only this month is beginning to require testing for purity. And that's not a good thing. It's not a good thing, especially for people who are sick, who are taking medicines that might make them sicker. For all of these reasons, and this is a big one, the press gets this wrong all the time, but doctors cannot prescribe medical marijuana. They can only recommend it. And that's because none of these products, as I said before, has been approved as safe or effective by FDA, a protection that we all enjoy and take for granted. Next slide, please. So there are two medicines that are marijuana related that have gone through the FDA approval process, and they are called Marinol and Sesamet, and both of those are synthetic versions of THC, the component in marijuana that is largely responsible for the high. And there are two more marijuana medicines on the horizon that have been developed by a pharmaceutical company in Great Britain. And these medicines are called Sativex and Epidiolex. Sativex is in phase 3 trials here in the United States. It's been approved in 34 other countries around the world. And if approved in the United States, doctors will be able to prescribe it for advanced cancer pain. And some other countries are also using it, where it's been approved, are using it for to relieve muscle spasticity in MS patients and neuropathic pain. Epidiolex is also a brand new drug. It's been tested in animals for 5 years, and it's now in clinical trials in the United States, and is undergoing expanded access programs for treating seizures in children who suffer from rare forms of epilepsy. Both of these drugs are on fast-track status with FDA, which means that unless something comes up in the trials, they should likely be approved in the next year or two, again for doctors to prescribe. So we have two medicines of all the ones that you hear about and read about in the press. We have two that have actually met FDA criteria and have been approved by FDA, and 2 more that look like they're likely to get there. Next slide, please. This is, as I said earlier, a very confusing issue to people, especially to people who aren't scientists and who aren't pharmaceutical pharmacists and who don't understand all of the complexities of science as new drugs are developed for distribution to the public. And there are 2 pamphlets here that may be helpful to you for further information. One is a guide to medical marijuana that you see on the left, and the other is a report of the phenomenon this year of the legalization of Charlotte's Web oil over the last 6 months. Next slide, please. So for those states that keep good data, and not all do, those states that have legalized marijuana for medicine, we are able to find from that data that the average age of patients ranges from 30 to 40, age 30 to 40, depending on the state, and that less than 5% of the patients have cancer or AIDS or other serious or terminal diseases, and that from 90 to 95% of the people who are obtaining medical marijuana cards and purchasing medical marijuana in dispensaries do so for chronic pain. Next slide, please. I think I'm going to get done a bit faster than I had planned. One of the things that we are deeply troubled by is the appeal of medical marijuana products to children. There's a phenomenon unfolding in the medical marijuana states of not only making marijuana available for smoking, but infusing marijuana into a number of different foods, and in these cases that you're going to see over the next few slides, into foods that are very attractive to children. And the question becomes, how can a child, even a young child, distinguish between a Jolly Rancher on the countertop that's been infused with marijuana and one that hasn't? And what we're beginning to see in Colorado particularly, and in some other states, is kids showing up at emergency rooms having overdosed because they've eaten a marijuana-infused candy or cookie or hazelnut spread like Nutella, etc. And this is not good. At the same time, we know that marijuana is a dangerous drug for children and adolescents, and that's because adolescent brains are undergoing the last phase of development, and they are much more sensitive to the impact of marijuana than adults' brains, and we worry a lot about that, and the research that we do have shows us why we should be worried about that. And as you'll see across the tops of these cards that I'm going to show you, these 2 and some more to follow, there are statements that come from the research information about how marijuana affects kids. Excuse me. On the backs of these cards are the studies that support the statements that are made on the fronts. Could we have the next slide, please? And all of these pictures that you're seeing as we go to the next slide and from this one are products that are sold in medical marijuana dispensaries in medical marijuana states that have been infused with marijuana, such as the chocolate chip cookies on the left and the gummy bears on the right. And then let's go to one more slide. Next slide, please. And this is a product coming out of Colorado from a firm called Dixie Elixirs, and they make soda pops in a number of different flavors. All of these are infused with marijuana and, again, appeal to children in a way that I don't think any of us wants to see happening. Next slide, please. So in the New England Journal of Medicine about 2 weeks ago, I guess last month now, it was a June issue of the New England Journal of Medicine, is an article that reviews all of the research, both on the harmful effects of marijuana and on what we know about medical marijuana, about how various components of marijuana may be helpful in medicine for various reasons. Hello? Am I still on? Okay. My computer just did something funny. So because the general public cannot get an article from a medical journal with any degree of ease, or needs to pay anywhere from $15 to $35 for a copy of the article, we have put together a fact sheet quoting the key points from this particular article. It's by Nora Volkow, who is the head of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, an NIH agency, and 3 other researchers. And it's the latest information about where we are, the state of the science on marijuana effects in terms of their harm, and on medical marijuana, potential uses of medical marijuana. The Institute of Medicine did a review of the research about 10 years ago and concluded that smoked marijuana was very unlikely to ever be an approved drug for any medical use, but where the promise of marijuana lies is in some of its individual components. There are about 400 chemicals that have been identified in marijuana. About 70 of those are unique to the cannabis plant. They're called cannabinoids. And individual cannabinoids, or sometimes 1 or 2 in combination, are likely to be what we're going to be seeing doctors prescribing once they've gone through the process of being approved by FDA. And finally, I think my last slide is coming up. If we could have that, please. National Families in Action, in partnership with Project SAM, Smart Approaches to Marijuana, and the Treatment Research Institute in Philadelphia, and a number of other organizations, has come together to create the Marijuana Report in order to help leaders make informed decisions about marijuana. We cover in this website all of the, or most, not all, most of the stories that the press is writing or broadcasting about marijuana across the United States and throughout the world, and we've organized these under 50 or so different categories. We add 10 to 20 stories a day. What we do is summarize those stories, and you'll notice at the end of each summary there's the word read. You can click on that to get to the original source, and you can click on any of the yellow categories that will take you to all of the summaries and stories that are listed under that category. And across the top, you'll see that there are a number of additional pages you can click on to find more analyses of what's going on, and we have quite a bit more coming, including a report that's not quite done yet, but will be completed and listed under reports across the top, called What Doctors Say About Medical Marijuana. That's the end of my presentation, and I got through it, I think, faster than my allotted time, so I'm happy to take any questions before I have to sign off.
Sure. Thank you so much for that presentation. We do have a few questions. The first is, at the outset of a commercial marijuana industry, you compared it to tobacco and alcohol as targeting children. As it's an industry that begins to develop, what are some actions that can be taken to prevent children from being targeted, if that is in fact the case?
That's a great question, and thank you for it. In 2010, when it looked like California was going to be the first state to legalize marijuana for recreational use through a ballot initiative, we brought together some of the top people in the country who work to prevent underage drinking and underage smoking, and asked them if you had had the opportunity to write a law allowing cigarettes to be sold in the 1860s when they first appeared in the United States, or if you'd had the opportunity to write the law that repealed prohibition in the 1930s, what kinds of provisions would you have put in those laws to prevent commercial industries from growing and expanding and targeting children? And the end result of that was another website we have called But What About the Children? And there are 12 provisions that grew out of that discussion with experts about making suggestions for how to protect kids from the commercialization. But the sad truth is that all of the research shows that availability drives use. And when a drug is legalized, it becomes infinitely more available, particularly if it's allowed to be commercialized as an ordinary commodity would be. And so the RAND Corporation, for instance, estimated that if it had California legalized marijuana for recreational use and regulated it like alcohol, there would have been some 8,000 marijuana outlets in the state, if like tobacco, more than 30,000 outlets in the state. And I think that's what we don't want to see. So you can find out more about that at butwhataboutthechildren.org, or just go to www.nationalfamilies, which will lead you to all our websites.
Great, thank you. And we certainly don't have time for all the questions, but I promise I will send them on to Ms. Rucci so that she can answer them at a later time. But one more question that I think maybe all of our presenters could answer. In your opinion, what state has the best model for an effective medical cannabis program?
None at this point.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much for joining us. I know you have to go.
I do, and I'm sorry that I have to leave, but I really have to go.
Nope. We appreciate your participation. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye. Now I will turn it over to Mr. Hurley.
I'm sorry, was that me? There we go. Hi, thank you everybody for tuning in. This is an incredibly important topic, and I appreciate the opportunity to present my viewpoint and my experiences on it. I have to say from the get-go I disagree with a number of the contentions of the last panelist, but I'll let Sue discuss some more of the science and some of the leaps in logic that she took. But I'll limit my discussions to my experience here on Arizona's medical marijuana law. Next slide. First, I'm just going to give you an overview. We're going to talk a little bit about the national background, and then I'll delve into Arizona's Proposition 203, which was our Citizens Initiative for Medical Marijuana Act, and our accompanying Department of Health Services rules that were promulgated to regulate the program. Of course, this is not legal advice, and you shouldn't rely on it. Selling and possessing marijuana is still against federal law. Next slide. So in 1996, California started the movement with Proposition 215. Now there are 20, I believe it's actually 22. I think I need to update this slide. 22 states in D.C. with functioning medical marijuana laws, and there are 5 other states with these new CBD-only laws. I think it's important to note that from the experience of many patients, these CBD-only laws are not sufficient. I think they're designed to treat kids with intractable epilepsy, and they may have a great deal of benefit for those children, but it leaves many people that could benefit from medical marijuana suffering unnecessarily. People with HIV, cancer, and serious chronic pain issues. Cannabis, particularly smoked whole plant cannabis, seems to alleviate these symptoms better than many, if not all, prescription medications with significantly less side effects. Again, these are the experiences that I have gleaned from representing and seeing a number of patients and providers here in Arizona. We have 2 other states that have passed medical marijuana laws that have banned, which effectively have banned smoking. They do allow vaporization, so that may sort of mitigate the impacts of this. But it's important to remember that smoking is often the easiest way for a patient to effectively titrate their medication. The dose response is different for everybody based on their experience with medical cannabis and their ability their experience with it. And so for some people, it makes a lot more sense to take a small puff and start with that and see how it affects them because the dose takes effect immediately. Next slide. Medical marijuana and its benefits are real, and the evidence supports this. Based on FDA-approved studies, and I think Sue will get into this later on. There are a limited number of applications that appear from those FDA studies, but when you really look at the patient experience that's out there, and you understand the fact that it's impossible to get the necessary research done through the federal government and the FDA, or nearly impossible, then you start to realize that the benefits are far more wide-ranging. Again, this is one of the best things out there for neuropathic pain, chronic and severe pain, and it's far, far less damaging than putting somebody on opioids, potentially deadly and very, very addictive medications. So I see a number of patients that are successfully withdrawing their use of opiates from their use of opiates by supplementing or replacing it with medical cannabis. Again, Stu will talk more about this, but the federal government restrictions prevent any sort of research into the benefits of this medicine. It's very easy to get grants and study drug if you want to research the negative effects of cannabis. But if you're trying to research the benefits of it, then it's dang near impossible. So it really presents a catch-22. They claim it has no medical benefit, but then you can't research it. You can't get the studied drug to research it. And that's because the National Institute of Drug Abuse, entity that is exclusively set up to prevent drug abuse and not research the benefits of drugs, they have a monopoly on the study drug, and it's impossible to get an FDA study unless you get study drug from NIDA. This is starting to loosen up literally just in the last recent year, and a lot of that has to do with Sanjay Gupta, I think, coming out and exposing the ridiculousness of the federal government. Next slide. But it's important to remember the conflict between state medical marijuana laws and the Federal Controlled Substances Act is still there. The federal government, the Department of Justice, did issue a memo in 2013 stating that it would not interfere with state programs as long as those programs are well regulated and they don't affect other federal priorities. There's a list of those 8 priorities. You can get a copy of the memo online pretty easily. But primarily selling to minors, connections to cartels, things of that nature. Again, it's important to remember, though, this is still not a legal defense. If the Department of Justice changes their mind or any of the federal government enforcement agencies decide they want to enforce these laws, that they are able to do so. Next slide. So Arizona passed our law in 2010. It's important to keep in mind that this is the 3rd time Arizona has passed a medical marijuana law over the past 2 decades. There were some fatal flaws in one of them, requiring a doctor to prescribe the medication, which, as we've heard, that is impossible. A doctor can only recommend medical cannabis at this point. Another time, the Arizona legislature essentially gutted the law and overturned it, despite it being passed in very popular fashion. And because of this, it led to Arizona voters passing what is known as the Voter Protection Act. And the Voter Protection Act now requires a three-quarter supermajority, and that any legislation must further the purpose of the initiative for the legislature to even touch a citizen's initiative. So these are popular initiatives. These things poll at 70 to 80%, generally speaking. In Arizona, however, the 3rd time around, it did only pass by 4,000 votes, so it was very close. We faced a number of oppositions from our political hierarchy, particularly our governor and attorney general and county attorney for our largest county here in encompasses Phoenix. They effectively allowed the patient registration to move forward, but they held back the dispensary portion of the program and attempted to get the whole law overturned by suing and saying that it was preempted by federal law. They started out in federal court. That was thrown out on procedural grounds. Then they ended up in state courts arguing the same thing. But the court there held what every other court, essentially every other court that has looked at this has held, is that states are free to pass their own laws. They are not preempted by the federal law. Although the federal government can still come in and enforce, the law is not preempted. Next slide. Arizona's law allows patients to qualify for legal protection if they have a debilitating medical condition. You can see on the slide sort of the list of these conditions. Of course, the most controversial one is something that causes severe and chronic pain. There was a previous stat that said something like 95% of people report severe and chronic pain. That's a misleading statistic because severe and chronic pain often and frequently goes with a number of these other presenting conditions. Something like 30 or 40% of the severe and chronic pain also are attendant to one of these other conditions that are put on here. So, and it's important to remember that severe and chronic pain is a very real thing. There are millions of Americans that suffer from this. It's one of the most common medical problems that people face in their lives, and to simply dismiss it as a loophole is not fair to those people, particularly when medical cannabis can allow them to manage their pain far better and with far less side effects and risk than opioids and other chronic pain medications. Our law does allow for addition of medical conditions to this list through a petition process and through an administrative process where DHS hears a case. There have been a number of attempts to add conditions here in Arizona, all of which have been unsuccessful until recently. PTSD, there's been a number of studies that have suggested PTSD can be managed effectively with medical cannabis, far better than any of the other pharmaceuticals that are currently being prescribed for it. And even though our Director of Health Services denied the petition, an administrative law judge recommended that he overturned that, and he has until tomorrow to either follow, modify, or reject that ALJ petition. We're really hoping that this gets added because I don't know that I need to tell anybody here, but we lose a veteran every 19 minutes, I believe, in this country to suicide, and PTSD is a huge contributor to that factor. So if we can present our veterans with something that will help them manage this, then I think we owe it to them to do that. Next slide. In order to qualify for our legal protections, a patient must get a doctor's recommendation. In Arizona, that means that can come from an MD, a naturopath, or a DO. I think it's important when you're considering these laws to allow a broad range of medical practitioners, particularly naturopaths, to recommend this medication. And the reason that is that many MDs are hesitant to prescribe it or to recommend it, not because they feel it wouldn't be effective or that it would be dangerous to the patient, but because they are afraid of losing their DEA license and, in fact, to prescribe other medications. In fact, we're seeing the DEA pressure doctors in Massachusetts for the first time in quite some time to relinquish their connections to medical cannabis dispensaries. So when people lament that it's only naturopaths and DOs that are recommending patients, there's a reason for that, and it's not because MDs don't believe in it. In fact, many MDs will say, absolutely, go ahead and try it, but I can't recommend it for you. Go to a naturopath and get your recommendation. Doctors have to maintain their patient card from DHS once they get the recommendation. They submit to DHS online with a picture and an attestation not to divert the medical marijuana and the doctor's recommendation. And shortly thereafter, the state issues an ID card with a barcode and a 20-digit HNID so that law enforcement can check the database in case they're ever pulled over. Law enforcement can't simply ping the database with a last name and go fishing for somebody. They have to have the 20-digit card to determine whether it's a valid card. And also that card allows a centralized database run by the state and accessible by every licensed dispensary to basically check whether the patient's card is valid and check whether they have obtained more than their allowable amount, which is 2.5 ounces every 2 weeks. And that patient card is an important part of regulating the program. Next card. So our law initially allowed for patients and caregivers to cultivate their own medication until dispensaries opened. This was relatively controversial, but essentially was put in as a backstop in case the powers that be held up the dispensary program, and in fact they did do that. So for about 2 years we had 30,000, 35,000 patients and no place for them to get their medication. So many of them, the vast majority of them, either elected to grow on their own or they designated a caregiver to grow for them. A caregiver could grow for up to 5 patients, 12 plants each, so including themselves could have up to 72 plants. That was probably a bit much, and it was never really intended to function that way. But because the dispensary program was held up, this directly led to this. The law said that once dispensaries opened, anybody within 25 miles of a dispensary lost their right to cultivate. So that was the way that the program was intended to work. But because of the political realities and the lawsuits, we ended up with a lot of people able to grow their own medication. This led to a proliferation of unlicensed and unregulated clubs, some of which started out really compassionately trying to provide very sick people with medication, some of which were simply exploiting this delay in the law to cover their desire to grow cannabis and to sell cannabis. So we're still dealing with this problem today, and if there's one lesson I can leave you with, if you pass these laws, make sure patients have suitable access, because once they have the legal protections, they will get the medication one way or another that they need. And it's absolutely vital to make sure that they have regulated access. Next slide. I think it's important to remember that once you have these dispensaries up and regulated, they're safe. They must comply with numerous security and inventory regulations. Their employees and principal officers must pass criminal background checks. The dispensaries also must contract with a medical director, again, MD and a naturopath or DO. And that medical director must help draft patient information and must be available to answer questions. And despite the previous panelists' contentions, most reputable dispensaries do test their medicines for potency and purity. Not currently required by our Department of Health Services, which is unfortunate. We as an industry have requested that they do that on a number of different occasions. But again, the political realities, I think, are preventing that from occurring. However, most dispensaries do provide these test results to their patients. Next slide. Just a look at what these look like. They're not terribly scary. Next slide. That's the waiting room there. And this is the back room. Very clean, very safe. Any medication or cash is stored in that secure area. Again, as far as crime is concerned, banks and pharmacies have a far higher percentage and rate of crime than dispensaries do. Next slide. This consistently polls at over 70%, so it's coming, and I believe that it's happening because it's the right thing to do. When you look at these patients and you look at in their eyes and you hear their stories, to deny them this medication, that's the real crime. The barriers to research are starting to weaken, thankfully, and I believe that once this research is done, that cannabinoids, medical cannabis, whole plant cannabis will be an integral part of a new wellness approach. There's substantial evidence to suggest that the cannabinoids can inhibit or reverse tumor and cancer growth. You simply Google cannabinoids and cancer and find out what they're doing. Incredible research is coming out of Israel on this particular issue. And there's substantial evidence to suggest that cannabinoids prevent or can inhibit the advancement of Alzheimer's and act as a neuroprotectant. Department of Health and Human Services, the federal government, has a patent for this, for cannabinoids. So go ahead and look this patent number up, and to suggest, for the federal government to suggest that medical marijuana has no medical benefit is simply ludicrous. Also, we're finding new ways to get some of the benefits without the high, if that's what's desired. Juicing the raw plant, and again, trying to promote CBD and not only THC. But again, I think it's important to have access to whole plant medication. Next slide. Again, important takeaways. If you're strictly compliant with the state laws, your risk at the federal level is practically non-existent, but theoretically still possible. And again, if these laws are coming, or if you're looking at passing these laws, providing sufficient, safe, secure, regulated, licensed access to the patients with legal protections is absolutely vital. Otherwise, patients will find a supply of their own, and you'll have a hard time regulating it. Next slide. I think this should be it, maybe. We currently have about 48,000 patients. This appears to be consistent with what is truly a medical program. Even though we have chronic and severe pain, there have been a number of naturopaths and doctors that have been reprimanded or punished for less than strict recommendation practices. So that has curbed abuse at the doctor level, and I think that's the appropriate regulatory choke point, because doctors have licensing boards, and if they are abusing the regulations, then that's where they need to be dealt with, just as though they were, abusing their ability to write a prescription for an opioid. These businesses are very capital intensive and difficult to run. They have tax issues, they have employment issues, they have security issues, they have banking issues. So if you are looking at these programs, I think it's wise to look at increasing the barriers to entry for prospective business owners. By doing this, I think you encourage strict compliance. When somebody has $2 million on the line in a business, I guarantee you they are not going to sell to minors. I guarantee you they're not going to sell to people without patient cards, because that risking that amount of capital for that one sale is absolutely ludicrous. So the more people have writing, the more likely they are to be compliant. If you have any questions, there are experts out there, attorneys, doctors, financial experts that are participating in this industry, and it's vital that you consult them if you need to. I think that's it. Next slide. That's it. Medical marijuana, again, these are patients, not criminals, and they should be treated as such. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. Now we will go to our last presenter, Dr. Sisley, and then we will have questions for Ryan and Dr. Sisley after she's done. Dr. Sisley seems to have lost audio connection. We're not able to get her back in the next little while. Her presentation will be online with all the other ones, and she will certainly be available to send questions to. She, I think, has some great experience to offer as one of the only people to ever get approved by the FDA for a medical marijuana efficacy study, and so she can certainly speak firsthand to the barriers preventing this kind of research. I guess I do also want to mention that this is understandably a complex topic, and there are very strong views on both sides, and just wanted to reiterate that SLC and CSG do not take a position on the issue, but we did just want to provide a forum to provide both sides of the argument. So with that, I think Dr. Sisley, are you back?
Yes, I am so sorry, you guys. My phone just died as you were introducing me, but I am all set now.
All right, take it away.
Okay, let me see if I can pull up. Okay, so sorry, for some reason I cannot see the slides anymore. Oh, there they are. Okay, perfect. So as Lauren said earlier, I'm the principal investigator on this study. It's a triple-blind randomized controlled trial that actually was approved by the FDA back in April of 2011, and you can see that 3 years later we're still waiting for this study to be implemented. So if you can go to the next slide, I'll tell you a little bit more. I'm using this study as sort of a launching pad to talk about some of the barriers to marijuana research. And I just want to emphasize that I've never tried marijuana. I'm not part of the marijuana industry. I don't write certifications for patients. I'm just a scientist. I'm trying to do research in this area and trying to collect objective data. And so let's look at the next slide. And I'll tell you a little bit more about this study. Basically, we're looking at the safety and efficacy of marijuana. So that's really important because if you know, NIDA will tell you that they endorse marijuana research robustly and they have tons of studies running around the country. But if you really examine those studies, you'll see that most of them are only looking at the harmful side effects of marijuana or the abuse potential of marijuana. Very few have ever slipped through the system that actually are examining the efficacy or the effectiveness of marijuana in treating specific conditions, and that's what's frustrating. So the studies that we have available are, you know, the efficacy studies are usually low-powered, and this is why this study is so crucial, because we're looking at safety and efficacy in the same trial and doing it in a randomized control environment, which is the most robust medical research you can conduct. That's considered the gold standard by the medical community. And so these veterans, these 70 veterans, will be randomized into these various dosages, and they'll also be randomized into 2 different delivery methods, both a smoking arm and a vaporizer group. And now if we look at the next slide, you'll see that this is how the DEA defines the different schedules. And many of you probably know this already, but what's interesting is when you look at the drugs that are actually lumped into Schedule 1, remember that Schedule 1 is defined as having no medical benefit and high abuse potential. And so if we look at the next slide, you'll see all the drugs that are actually in Schedule 1. And it's always been astonishing to the medical community that marijuana is lumped in to Schedule 1 with all these, you know, drugs that are considered to have much higher toxicity, psychedelic drugs and other. And so I think that's always been inexplicable to the medical community. And yet when you look down at Schedule 4, which is defined by the DEA as drugs having you know, minimal abuse potential and high efficacy, I think, you know, the doctors are even more stunned by that, because we all know that drugs like Xanax, Ativan, those drugs are highly abused and have a very high street value, and yet those are categorized as Schedule 4. I think that really calls into question the way we, in this country, we use law enforcement to make decisions about the medical benefit of a drug. The fact that the DEA is defining these schedules, I think, is very problematic. And there was just a national report that that challenged our country to consider, you know, finding an outside agency, maybe a non-governmental scientific advisory council, to really re-examine these schedules and help them align with real medical thinking. So let's look at the next slide. You'll see here, this is what we've termed the NIDA monopoly, but that's exactly what it is. The National Institute on Drug Abuse does hold the, you know, they are the only legal supply of marijuana for any FDA-approved trials. So NIDA, you know, basically this is a really strange situation, because marijuana is the only Schedule 1 drug that is subject to this monopoly. No other Schedule 1 drugs are required to go through NIDA for, you know, for researchers to purchase. And so if we look at the next slide, you'll see how this all started. Back in '68, this facility that is housed at the University of Mississippi was started to grow cannabis for these FDA-approved trials. And the challenge here is, if NIDA decides not to sell marijuana to a group of researchers, your study will not be implemented ever. And so, and NIDA has, you know, is under no timetable. That's been the other big hurdle, is the FDA is under a 30-day timetable. So if we send a study design to them, they have to respond in a month. But NIDA has no such timetable, and neither do any of the other obstacles that that marijuana is confronted with. So when you talk about the Public Health Service review, the DEA, and NIDA, none of those agencies have any timetable, so they can effectively destroy a study just by delay. Now let's look at the next slide. And you'll see here that this was an example. My sponsor, MAPS, had tried to purchase marijuana for another FDA-approved trial looking at vaporizers, which is a very important area of research for the physician community. And the fact is that they still, you know, were never able to persuade NIDA to to sell them the study drug even though it was approved by the FDA. And so the contrast is when you're doing an LSD study, after you've obtained FDA approval, you simply move to implement your study. There's no second redundant review required by the Public Health Service, but marijuana is subject to that review, and it's inexplicable that it's the only Schedule I drug that has these additional hurdles. So next slide. I just wanted to point out that this has been getting a tremendous amount of national media attention for many years now. So ever since our initial FDA approval, many mainstream media outlets have been covering this issue and trying to shine a spotlight on this injustice, but we haven't been able to persuade lawmakers that this is a problem until recently. So next slide, you'll see that basically this is the reason we want to, we're so determined to implement this study, because you can see that how prevalent PTSD is in our country. Actually, this is probably a low estimate. They're thinking over 20% of soldiers coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan will have PTSD, and many of them will be treatment resistant, meaning they failed all the standard treatments and nothing has worked. And then you can see there the amount of disability payments back in 2010. I suspect that that number is much higher now. Next slide. And this is just, again, many media outlets reporting on the frustration of veterans who have been unable to find relief from standard, conventional, FDA-approved treatments. Next slide. And this is why we need to study it, because right now there's only 2 treatments on the market that are FDA approved for PTSD. So all we have are Zoloft and Paxil, and these 2 meds are very disappointing. Any veteran will tell you who's tried these 2 that, the most onerous side effects, weight gain, sexual dysfunction, this is for veterans who are desperately trying to reintegrate into their families, into their communities, to, be stuck gaining 20, 30 pounds in the first few months and having inability to have relations with their spouse is really an awful experience for them and very demoralizing. So I think that that's why we're so focused on getting this underway. Yeah, go ahead and next slide. And so here's, I've been impressed over the last 14 years. I've been working with veterans trying to understand how to help them with PTSD, and I've been impressed with the number of high-ranking vets even who are coming out disclosing their use of marijuana, and it wasn't easy for them. Believe me, these vets really want to be on the side of the law, and they don't want to be judged for this, but they're, after we've exhausted all the conventional treatments, these veterans are admitting that they've been successfully using this plant to manage their symptoms. Nobody's arguing this is a cure, but there seems to be a tremendous mounting anecdotal evidence from these vets saying that they are able to work with this plant and be functional. So next slide, you'll see here, this is now we have a biological basis for why this plant works. The endocannabinoid system was probably the biggest discovery of that decade, and it really lit a fire under tons of pharmaceutical companies to realize that this was an important area of research. But amazingly, these drug companies, despite the first speaker who talked about all the different meds that are on the market or coming to the market, the truth is that the pharmaceutical companies have not been able to mimic the effect of the plant, and the meds that are out there currently are hugely disappointing. And that's what happens, when you try to synthesize one cannabinoid and try to extract it and synthesize it into a pill. It's always a failure because this plant seems to be, it's so complex. The plant has 80 different phytocannabinoids in it that all seem to work together synergistically to create what we call an entourage effect. And that's why this is so crucial to understand how this plant works as whole plant medicine and not necessarily just in pill form or extract, because the whole plant is what people are using and what they will continue to use. And so that's why what our study was striving to do was try to do real-world research and really understand what people are doing day to day in their homes. And I think that the plant is, that was the goal of the study, was to try to enable whole plant marijuana to go through the proper drug development process of the FDA. That's what we're striving for. Next slide. So you'll see here that this would be the only randomized controlled trial looking at the use of marijuana in PTSD, which is why we're pushing so hard for this. And we've been, the study was submitted to the FDA actually 5 years ago. So we've been, it's taken this long to get to this point, and we're finally on the cusp of implementing this. Next slide. Here's the timeline. So this will show, give you some understanding of how long it takes to conduct these trials. The intense barriers. And we've managed to hurdle all of these, but it has taken us, to this point at 4 years later, and we still haven't even gotten underway. We're not even screening patients yet because we still have several more hurdles to go. Next slide. So I just wanted to give you the latest developments because this is even more fascinating. So our Public Health Service letter finally came in basically at the end of March of 2014. So this year in March we got this letter that we hit, that was really the biggest bottleneck. The Public Health Service review, as I said, has no timeline. So generally, if you dare to ask to do an efficacy study looking at the effectiveness of marijuana, you usually get put into this permanent review process where you never emerge. But what was amazing was when Dr. Gupta's segment came out on CNN, just a few days, he called out NIDA about their suppression of this research, and suddenly 3 days later I had a letter from the Public Health Service green-lighting our study. It's hard to ignore the timing of this. And then 1 week after the Public Health Service approved the study, NIDA proceeded to inform us that they had no marijuana to sell us. And that is a huge problem because NIDA had actually sent us a letter, back in 2011 when our study was first approved by the FDA. NIDA had confirmed in writing that they had all the strains that we needed to conduct the study. That was not true. So NIDA then also admitted in writing recently that they have no track record of growing high CBD strains. So the cannabinoid that people are most interested in right now is cannabidiol, right? Because CBD seems to have no psychoactive effects. So people are really particularly fascinated by the chance to use this in pediatric patients so it doesn't cause them to feel high. But unfortunately, NIDA doesn't have any track record of growing this, even though they claim that they did back in 2011. And so this is hugely problematic because if you go to the next slide, you guys will see that NIDA, under the Controlled Substances Act, I'm sorry, let me just show you this real quick. So Dr. El Soli has his hand in a barrel of ground up marijuana. This is from the University of Mississippi. They basically take the whole plant, throw it into a grinder, and then roll it up. If you go to the next slide, you'll see they roll it up into these cigarettes that get mailed out to investigators nationally. And the next slide will show you that if you unroll these cigarettes, you'll see that sadly this study drug is mostly stems, sticks, and leaves. I think there's another picture in the next slide that'll show you that very little of the flowering plant material that most would believe is where the therapeutic potential lies. So many physicians are arguing that this sabotages the studies from the beginning when you're trying to do efficacy research, and this is the product that you're sent by NIDA. It's very concerning. Next slide. So anyway, this is our hypothesis, that we believe that marijuana will ease the symptoms of PTSD in a dose-dependent manner, and we believe that the high CBD strains will be most efficacious in helping with the PTSD. Next slide. And these are the safety measures. This is where we run into problems with finding a home for this research. So when we talk about barriers to marijuana research, there are really three big ones. The first one that you think would be the easiest, but is not, is finding a safe, secure home for this work at, for instance, at a state university. Because what happens is state universities don't like the optics of having to conduct these safety sessions. You can see here that the FDA requires us to do these 4-hour-long safety sessions where we actually administer marijuana study drug to these patients on campus. So we would be either smoking, teaching veterans how to smoke and vaporize marijuana in a standardized fashion per our protocol, and then we would also be monitoring them for adverse events, which is absolutely vital. We want to make sure many of these study subjects will be naive to marijuana. They may never have used it, and we want to make sure that if they do have a panic attack or a psychotic episode, that we want to be there to manage that medically and to collect that data. So next slide. You'll see here, this is how the breakdown of our protocol. Real quick, I'll just show you that you can see the patients initially will be randomized into these 5 different dosages, and yes, there is a 0% placebo-controlled marijuana, if you can believe it. NIDA does produce this. It looks indistinguishable from the plant where all the cannabinoids are leached out of it. And you can see the breakdown. So stage 1, there'll be 4 weeks of home self-administration of the marijuana after they've completed those 2 safety sessions on campus, and they will actually be provided marijuana study drug to use at home. And then there'll be a 2-week abstinence period where they'll be tapered off the medicine will be stopped abruptly for 2 weeks. We'll be monitoring them throughout that process, collecting tons of data on their experience, on their blood levels, everything. And then they'll be re-randomized into this stage 2, which you can see is a more narrowed down dosing that conforms to what we believe will probably be the most optimal dosing structure for these folks, which includes the high CBD strains. So next slide. And you can see why people are so interested in vaporizing, because it does seem to, many of you may have not seen a vaporizer, but that's what it looks like. The Volcano is kind of the gold standard, but this is, basically the air is, wafted across the plant material, and it's collected in a bag, and the patients breathe the study drug out of the bag. And if you see the next slide, you'll see the reasons we're so interested in vaporizers, because it does seem that vaporizers offer a chance to ingest the medicine without having any products of combustion. So for physicians, we don't want people smoking anything. So vaporizers offer a really crucial alternative. Next slide. And so let's see here. Let me see. Do you guys have one more slide after this? Oh, there we go. Yeah, so these are the things, just so you guys understand how the FDA ensures safety and prevents diversion of study drug. These are all the things that we were required to implement. Lock boxes, video camera. We were required to tape all the patients actually administering the drug and review all of those videotapes. So it's very rigorous. We're trying hard to make this to ensure the integrity of the study, so that and everybody is obviously, it's part of their informed consent and part of their enrollment. They're required to confirm that they will adhere to all this, and if they don't, they'll be removed from the study. So they will be given only 1 week of study drug at a time. These are all things that the FDA approved. Next slide. And this is what I wanted to talk with you about. So this is, I call it the continuing saga, because it's so incredible that, in 2011, they wrote to us and said that they had the high CBD marijuana that we needed, and now in May of 2014, suddenly they don't have it. They said that they would grow it, but that it probably wouldn't be ready until the fall. And we estimate that, once they've dried, processed, and packaged it, it probably realistically won't be ready until January of next year. And yet we were ready to implement our study, back in March and April when we got the Public Health Service letter. We basically were ready to implement, except for the university was unable to find a location for the study. And that was another, as I said, one of the biggest barriers. Finding a home for this research is problematic with state universities who are concerned about having marijuana on their campuses and the optics of, the possible threat to their federal funding and other issues. So, so that's something to be aware of. But the other, the other barriers are this NIDA monopoly and this Public Health Service review. So those two things can delay marijuana research for years, as is evidenced by our study. So now NIDA has agreed to grow the marijuana, although we don't know if they can grow high CBD strains. They're difficult to grow, and that's true. It's proven by how rare it is to be able to find a high CBD clone. They're rare and difficult to cultivate. So next slide. So anyway, they said that we are targeting the protocol. You know, we gave them the protocol the FDA approved with the various dosages and hybrids, and they said we're targeting it, but we can't commit, which again puts into question. That's why I titled this "Failed NIDA Monopoly," because it is a failure. The fact that, you know, the Controlled Substances Act says that they have to provide an uninterrupted and adequate supply for researchers. They have not been able to fulfill that. And I think that as lawmakers, you guys have an opportunity to challenge that once and for all. We've been questioning this for years, and now finally there's a giant light shined on NIDA, because there's so many states that are determined to get this research underway, and now we're seeing the obvious blockades to conducting this work. Next slide. And I'll just go real quick that there's a University of Massachusetts, Dr. Craker is a world-renowned plant biologist who's been petitioning the federal government through the DEA for over 10 years now, asking to be another site, to provide an alternative to the NIDA monopoly to grow cannabis to spec for researchers in FDA-approved trials. And if you look at the next slide, you'll see that they've continued to fight this. The DEA's own administrative law judge actually recommended that they go ahead and allow this second site. But if you look at the next slide, you'll see that sadly the DEA refused this. The DEA rejected the opportunity to approve this site, and Dr. Craker continues to fight for this, and hopefully one day, there'll be multiple sites at multiple universities growing cannabis to spec, including these high CBD strains that are so challenging. Next slide will show you so basically you can see the legal machinations that have occurred back and forth, but the bottom line is in 13, the courts denied the ability to end this NIDA monopoly, and so at this point NIDA is still the only legal supply of marijuana. So next slide, I think we're almost done here. So I just wanted to point out that state medical associations are really digging into this now. My own ARMA, the Arizona Medical Association, has passed this resolution 3 years in a row now, demanding that all of these absurd barriers to marijuana research be eliminated, and that once a study has been approved by the FDA and approved by a university IRB, that it would simply that NIDA would be required to sell these investigators marijuana at cost for their studies. And that's been the position of many, chapters of organized medicine. So it's great to see ARMA, the collective voice of physicians in our state, stepping up and, demanding this, because we all know the physician community here is frustrated that we are stuck as gatekeepers for a plant that has never been allowed to go through the proper drug development process of the FDA. And that's all we're asking with this study, that this, that hopefully the study will one day be implemented and we can actually, try to understand in a very objective way the value or the lack of value that the plant has. That's what the idea of this. So let me just see if there's one more slide. That's it. Oh yeah, it's just that was the resolve we just went over from this is the resolution they've passed 3 years in a row, and this is just the bottom line that, if I'm a physician, but I'm also a human being, so hearing these stories over and over again, it's impossible to ignore the potential that this plant has, that it may be helpful, particularly in treating combat vets. I mean, as Ryan mentioned earlier, the notion that 22 veterans a day are committing suicide in this country, and the chance that medical marijuana may have prevented even a few of those deaths. I think we have a duty to our servicemen and women to understand the potential of this plant, if any potential, and try to figure out how to harness it, and not necessarily always in pill form, not about pharmaceutical companies finding patents and making a financial score. It's also about understanding whole plant marijuana and keeping this available in an affordable way to patients in a legal and regulated market. So I think that's the end of my talk.
Thank you, Dr. Sisley. We have gone a little bit over our scheduled end time, but I do want to try to get in a question for both of y'all. And the first question will be for Mr. Hurley. And going back to the question I asked previously, what state has the best model for a medical cannabis program, and were there any states or state program components that Arizona was looking at when they were building their program?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think I am partial to Arizona's law, not just because I live here, but because I think this was the first large-scale program that was regulated from the ground up. I think Colorado has done a decent job after the fact, but the problem was they really started out with a completely unregulated program, and it was, you know, all of a sudden they had 100,000 patients and 1,000 dispensaries in Denver, and they really tried to put the genie back in the bottle, and I think are doing that successfully now. But Arizona was the first program to be regulated from the ground up. If it wasn't for the delay in the dispensary implementation, we would have had far less problems. If the law had just gone forward as it was intended to, we would have by far had the best program in the country. So I think Arizona's regulations have been a basis for people going forward. I think Massachusetts is going to be an interesting example of sort of the next state to build off of Arizona's lessons. So if I had to say the next program to look at, I would say Massachusetts.
All right, and for Dr. Sisley, just real quick, so, you know, to kind of provide some understanding of what is being done is, you know, if the DEA and NIDA have been growing research-grade marijuana for so long, but not approving efficacy studies, what have they been approving, or what have they been providing marijuana to research?
Right. Now, the bulk of the studies that are approved in the U.S. are all about looking at the harmful side effects of marijuana and the abuse potential of marijuana. So those are NIDA-funded studies, because NIDA's mission obviously is to curb illicit drug abuse. So they support studies highlighting the abuse potential, the potential for addiction and dependency from marijuana. So that's the bulk of it. And so if you look at the research, for instance, all the studies that have come out, you know, even in the last couple of years, are all talking about, you know, the headline about marijuana causing brain damage. All these are NIDA-funded studies, and highly questionable, actually. The data, most of these studies have been chastised by some very renowned scientists, saying that they're, you know, that many of them seem biased. So I think that the opportunity to study safety and efficacy in the same trial is crucial.
All right. Thank you all, and that is all the time we have today. But for our listeners, please feel free to send me any questions that didn't get answered, or any that, you know, you would like an answer for, and we'll certainly be happy to connect you with any of the presenters. And then I just wanted to thank my CSG colleague, Carrie Abner, for her assistance with the technical aspects. And if there's anything else SLC can do for all of y'all, please don't hesitate to contact us. And I hope you'll enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you so much.